He bought her, a signature on a contract to be his duchess. He never meant for her to matter. But when he finally declared his love in front of all of London society, was it too late to save them from the scandal he had created? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The rain fell in relentless, slanting sheets against the tall windows of the Duke's London townhouse, each drop a tiny hammer against the glass. Inside the study, the world was muffled and dim. Heavy velvet curtains, the color of dried blood, blocked out what little remained of the miserable afternoon sun, and the air was thick with the oppressive scent of old leather, beeswax, and the ghost of cold cigar smoke. It was a room that suffocated, a chamber of immense wealth and profound loneliness. Miss Margaret Wren sat on the edge of a chair that was far too large and ornate for her. Her simple grey dress, though impeccably clean and well-mended, was a stark island of modesty in an ocean of opulence. She kept her hands clenched tightly in her lap, the knuckles white, a single point of betrayal in her otherwise flawless composure. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird caught in a cage, but her face remained a mask of quiet elegance. Across the vast expanse of a mahogany desk, a desk that seemed carved from the heart of a petrified forest, sat Duke Henry Ashcroft. He was a man who seemed forged from ice and authority, his features sharp and unforgiving, his dark hair untouched by the day's exertions. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, missed nothing. They catalogued the slight tremor in her brother's hand, the desperate hope warring with terror in her own gaze, the way the worn fabric of her sleeve had been carefully turned to hide a fraying cuff. He was not looking at a woman in distress, he was assessing an asset. Between them, standing like a prisoner before the bench, was Arthur Wren. Her younger brother, so often full of youthful arrogance and charm, was now pale and trembling, his handsome face slick with a film of cold sweat. Fear had shattered him. "Your brother's poor judgment is a common affliction among young men of his station," the Duke began, his voice a low, resonant timbre that held no trace of warmth. It was the sound of contracts being signed and fortunes being broken. "The consequences, however, are now my concern." He gestured almost dismissively toward a small, damning stack of papers on his desk, the markers for a ruinous gambling debt Arthur had accrued with a moneylender of singular ruthlessness. "I have acquired the debt." Margaret's breath hitched. The debt was astronomical, enough to utterly destroy their family name and cast them into the sort of genteel poverty from which there was no return. "I am prepared to be generous, Miss Wren," Henry continued, his eyes locking onto hers, "but my generosity has a price." Margaret found her voice, though it was thinner than she would have liked. "We cannot pay you, Your Grace, not a sum like that, but we will endeavor, over time." "I am not interested in your money," he cut her off, the words sharp as glass. He leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning in protest. "I find myself in need of a wife, a duchess, someone of respectable birth and quiet disposition to manage my households and, more importantly, to quell the tiresome rumors in society about my reclusive nature." The room fell silent, save for the drumming of the rain and Arthur's ragged breathing. The proposition hung in the air, so monstrous and cold that Margaret could not at first grasp its shape. "You would buy a wife?" she whispered, the words catching in her throat. The composure she had fought so hard to maintain was cracking. "You would force a woman into a loveless marriage to satisfy a whim." "Not a whim, a necessity," he corrected, his tone utterly devoid of emotion. "I require a duchess. You require your family's salvation. It is a perfectly balanced transaction. Your affections are irrelevant to the terms. I will erase your brother's debt in its entirety. The scandal will vanish. Your family name will be protected. In return, you will become my wife. Those are the terms." The walls of the trap were closing in, and Margaret could feel the cold, hard steel of them against her skin. Her love for her foolish, beloved brother was a physical ache in her chest, warring with the profound violation of her own future, of every girlish dream she had ever secretly harbored of a marriage born of affection and respect. Henry's detached cruelty was a weapon, and he wielded it with surgical precision. Arthur's shame was a third presence in the room, a heavy, suffocating blanket of misery. She looked at her brother, at his bowed head and shaking shoulders, and knew she had no choice at all. The drawing-room of the Wrens' modest home was a world away from the Duke's oppressive study. Here the furniture was worn, The chintz faded from years of sunlight, but everything was lovingly maintained. It was a room that spoke of gentle poverty, of a family holding on by a thread, but holding on together. Margaret stood by the window, watching the last of the rain dry on the cobblestones, her reflection a pale, ghostly image in the glass. She had left Arthur in the Duke's study to finalize the horrifying details, a silent, broken figure signing away his sister's life to save his own. Now, he stood in the center of their drawing room, his face a mask of guilt and self-loathing. "No, Meg, I won't have it," he burst out, his voice raw with anguish. "I will not let you do this. I'll sell my commission. We'll go to America. We can start again. Anything but this." Margaret turned from the window, her own terror a cold, hard knot in her stomach. But she could not let him see it. For his sake, she had to be the strong one. She adopted a tone of cool, pragmatic resolve, a chilling echo of the Duke's own manner. "And live as what? Impoverished exiles forever looking over our shoulders?" she asked, her voice steady. "This is not just about you, Arthur. It is about our name, our future. The Wren name will be dragged through every gutter in London. This is a solution." She forced a brave, almost brittle smile. "I will be a duchess. Think of the security that will provide. Our troubles will be over." "But your life, Meg, your happiness," he cried, his eyes swimming with tears. "He is a monster, a cold, heartless devil. Everyone knows it. He is a man who requires a duchess, and I am a woman who requires her family's salvation," she recited, the Duke's words sounding alien on her own lips. She walked to him and took his hands, her grip firm and reassuring, a blatant lie. "It is a bargain, Arthur, a practical arrangement, and I will not hear another word against it. It is done." He stared at her, at the unshakable resolve in her eyes, and finally his shoulders slumped in defeat. He saw her strength, but he could not see what it cost her, the silent scream trapped behind her serene expression. He could not see that in saving him, she was sacrificing the very essence of herself on the cold altar of a loveless contract. Her fear was a secret she would have to learn to keep, the first of many in her new life. The wedding was held in a small private chapel on the Duke's London estate. It was a place of cold stone and echoing silence, the air smelling of damp and disuse. There were no flowers, no music, only the grim finality of the occasion. The necessary witnesses, a pinched-faced solicitor, and the Duke's stony-eyed man of business, stood like gargoyles in the shadows, their presence a testament to the contractual nature of the day. Margaret stood at the altar in a simple cream gown she had made herself, the fine stitches a testament to her skill and the poverty that necessitated it. She felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. She felt the chill of the chapel's air not on her skin, but deep within her bones, a permanent cold settling around her heart. Henry stood beside her, a rigid, formal statue in impeccable black. He was taller than she had realized, his presence an overwhelming physical reality. When it was his turn to speak, his vows were a monotone, the sacred words of love and devotion spoken with the same inflection he might use to dictate a business letter. He was not making a promise, he was sealing a transaction. When the priest prompted her, Margaret's own voice was a near inaudible whisper. The priest's words, meant to join two souls, instead sounded like the reading of a verdict, each Latin phrase a nail in the coffin of her girlhood dreams. She promised to love, honor, and obey, and each word was a perjury against her own heart. Then came the ring. It was a heavy band of plain gold, unadorned and severe. As Henry pushed it onto her finger, its cold weight felt less like a symbol of union and more like the first link in a chain. It was a manacle, binding her to him, to this cold, empty life. The gold on her finger was the price of her brother's freedom. As they turned to exit the chapel, a married couple in the eyes of God and the law, he placed his hand on the small of her back to guide her. The touch was not a gesture of affection, not a tender claim. It was a gesture of ownership. It was the hand of a man taking possession of a valuable, if inconvenient, new acquisition. The Duchess of Ashcroft. She had the title, but as she walked out of the cold chapel and into the bleak afternoon, she knew she was nothing more than the woman he had bought. The journey to Ashcroft Manor was conducted in a silence as profound and heavy as the grave. They sat opposite one another in the Duke's perfectly sprung carriage, the rhythmic clatter of the horses' hooves on the road the only sound between them. Margaret kept her gaze fixed on the passing countryside, a blur of green and gold under a watery sun, refusing to look at the man who was now her husband. He, in turn, seemed perfectly content to ignore her, his attention given over to a sheaf of papers he had produced from a leather satchel. He was not a husband returning home with his bride. He was a businessman returning to his office. Ashcroft Manor appeared suddenly, a sprawling Gothic masterpiece of grey stone and towering spires that seemed to claw at the sky. It was less a house and more a fortress, a monument to wealth and power that was as imposing and unyielding as its master. As the carriage crunched to a halt on the gravel drive, a line of servants spilled from the enormous oak doors, assembling in a rigid, formal line. They were a sea of black and white uniforms, their faces carefully blank, their eyes full of a wary curiosity. Henry led her up the steps, his hand once again a cold, impersonal weight on her arm. "Welcome to Ashcroft Manor, Your Grace," he said, the title sounding foreign and absurd to her ears. The great hall was vast and silent, a cavern of marble and dark wood. The air was still and cold, carrying the faint, dusty scent of a place unloved and uninhabited. Suits of armor stood like silent sentinels along the walls, and the furniture, what she could see of it, was shrouded in white dust sheets, giving the impression of a grand ballroom populated by ghosts. A woman detached herself from the line of servants. She was tall and severe, her grey hair pulled back into a bun so tight it seemed to pull at the corners of her eyes. Her black dress was immaculate, her posture ramrod straight. This, Margaret knew instinctively, was the formidable housekeeper, Mrs. Davies. "Your Grace," the woman said, her voice as starched as her apron, offering a curtsy that was correct to the millimetre, but held no warmth. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, swept over Margaret in a single comprehensive glance, taking in the simple gown, the unadorned hair, the quiet dignity of her posture. It was a look of profound scrutiny, and Margaret felt herself being weighed and found wanting. "Mrs. Davies will show you to your rooms," Henry stated, already turning away. "I have business in my study. We will begin your orientation on the morrow." He was dismissing her. On their wedding day, in their home, he was dismissing her like a footman. But before she could even process the sting, he paused. "Actually, a brief tour is in order. It is best you understand the scope of your duties immediately." What followed was not a welcoming tour, but an inspection. Henry strode through the silent, echoing halls, pointing not at family portraits or architectural marvels, but at areas of responsibility. "This is the dining room. You will be responsible for approving the menus with the cook each week. The silver must be polished on a rotating schedule." He gestured toward a long, shrouded gallery. "The ballroom. You will oversee its preparation for the biannual tenants' ball and any other social functions I deem necessary. The accounts for such events will be submitted to you for initial approval." He led her through drawing rooms and morning rooms, his voice a cold, continuous litany of her duties. The menus, the staff, the social calendar, the household accounts. It was a full-time occupation, just as he had promised. Margaret felt a strange sense of dislocation, as if she were interviewing for a position, not stepping into the role of lady of the manor. Finally, they reached a long corridor that branched off from the main artery of the house. It was darker here, the air colder. "This is the West Wing," Henry said, his voice dropping, losing its businesslike cadence and taking on a harder edge. "It is my private space. You are not to enter it. The staff does not enter it." "Is that understood?" "Perfectly," Margaret replied, her own voice quiet but firm. She met his gaze without flinching, and for a moment she saw something flicker in his eyes, a brief spark of surprise before the icy mask slammed back into place. As they turned back, she saw Mrs. Davies watching them from the far end of the hall. The housekeeper's expression was unreadable, but Margaret had the distinct impression that she had just been tested, and perhaps had not entirely failed. Later, she would hear the housekeeper's voice drifting from the servants' hall, speaking to a young maid. "She has a steady eye, not the flighty sort I was expecting. We shall see if she has the stomach for this place." Margaret clutched her hands together. She would need more than stomach, she thought. She would need a heart of stone to match their own. The nights were the worst. The silence of Ashcroft Manor was a living entity, pressing in on her from all sides. In her vast, lonely bedchamber, with its cold silk sheets and heavy, funereal draperies, sleep was a skittish creature that refused to be caught. After hours of staring into the oppressive darkness, Margaret rose, pulling a simple woolen shawl over her nightdress. She could not bear the confines of the room a moment longer. She wandered the labyrinthine corridors, her bare feet silent on the cold stone floors. The moonlight, filtered through the tall arched windows, painted ghostly patterns on the walls. The house felt different at night, less a museum and more a mausoleum, a tomb for a family's forgotten happiness. Drawn by a sliver of warm light from under a door, she found herself standing before the library. Hesitantly, she pushed the door open. It was the one room in the entire manor that felt alive. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves soared into the shadows, crammed with thousands of volumes. A fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow over the comfortable leather armchairs and the rich Persian rug. And there, in a chair by the fire, was Henry. He had not heard her enter. He was lost in a book, his head bent, the harsh, authoritative lines of his face softened and made human by the firelight. The cravat at his throat was loosened, and a lock of dark hair had fallen across his forehead. In that unguarded moment, he looked younger, not like a formidable duke, but simply like a man finding solace in the written word. She must have made some small sound, a soft intake of breath, because he looked up, startled. His eyes widened, and for a second he looked almost vulnerable. Then the mask of cold indifference slammed back into place, his posture straightening, his expression hardening. "You could not sleep," he stated. "It was not a question." "The house is very quiet," she offered, her voice a soft intrusion into the peaceful sanctuary. His eyes narrowed, as if expecting a complaint, a demand. Instead, she drifted toward the shelves, her fingers ghosting over the leather spines. "It is a magnificent collection." She pulled a slim volume from the shelf. "Elizabeth Barrett Browning." He seemed taken aback. "You read poetry?" "When I can," she said simply. She looked at him, a genuine, uncalculated curiosity in her eyes. "I am surprised to find a man of industry and finance reading poetry, Your Grace." A strange expression crossed his face, a flicker of something she could not name. "My mother had a fondness for it," he said, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "It is an indulgence I allow myself on occasion, a distraction." For a few precious moments, they spoke of the author, of a particular turn of phrase, of the power of a well-chosen word. The Duke was gone, replaced by an intelligent, well-read man who could debate the merits of a sonnet with a surprising passion. The air between them, usually so fraught with tension and the unspoken weight of their contract, was suddenly light, comfortable. A fleeting, fragile intimacy bloomed in the warmth of the fire, a connection forged over a shared love of words. Margaret felt a strange, unsettling flutter in her chest. Then, as if suddenly remembering who she was and what she represented, he stood abruptly. The moment shattered. "It is late," he said, his voice once again clipped and distant. "You should return to your room." The warmth vanished, the connection was severed. He was the Duke of Ashcroft again, and she was the woman he had bought. As Margaret retreated from the library, the warmth of the fire clinging to her for a few steps before the corridor's chill reclaimed her, she was left with a profound sense of loss for something she had not even known she wanted. And she was more unsettled than ever, for in that brief glimmer of humanity, she had seen a depth to her husband that was far more dangerous than his cruelty. A man made only of ice could be endured. A man with a hidden fire could break your heart. Their first public appearance as a married couple was at a glittering London ball, a maelstrom of shimmering silk, flashing diamonds, and whispered secrets. The moment they entered the ballroom, a hush fell, followed by a rising tide of murmurs. They were the focus of every eye, the subject of intense, malicious speculation. Margaret felt the heat of 100 stares, the sharp prick of gossip, and she had to consciously fight the urge to shrink behind her husband's imposing frame. She lifted her chin, her posture regal, her expression serene, a perfect imitation of a duchess at ease. Henry seemed oblivious, or perhaps impervious to the attention. He guided her through the throng with a cool detachment, his hand resting formally on the small of her back. But Margaret could feel the tension in his fingers, the rigid set of his shoulders. He was aware of every whisper, every sidelong glance. They were soon cornered by Lady Beatrice, a woman whose face was a sweet, powdered mask that failed to hide the venom in her eyes. "My dear Duke," she cooed, her voice dripping with saccharine insincerity. "And the new Duchess, to be swept off your feet so suddenly. One must wonder at the lady's persuasive charms." The insult was as sharp and pointed as a stiletto, aimed directly at Margaret's honor and implying she had trapped the Duke through some unseemly means. A hot flush of shame and anger rose in Margaret's cheeks. She opened her mouth to offer a dignified, if cool, reply, but Henry spoke first. "Indeed," he said, his voice dropping to a temperature that could have frozen the champagne in Lady Beatrice's glass. "My wife's charms are considerable. It is a pity the same cannot be said for everyone's manners." He met the woman's shocked gaze with a look of pure, undiluted ice. "Now, if you will excuse us." He steered Margaret away, leaving Lady Beatrice speechless and fuming, her powdered face mottled with rage. Margaret was stunned. She had expected him to ignore the comment, to let her suffer the sting of society's cruelty alone. His defense, however cold and impersonal, was a defense nonetheless. It was not for her sake, she told herself, but for his own. He was defending his name, his choice, the honor of the Duchess of Ashcroft, not Margaret Wren. And yet, a tiny, traitorous flicker of gratitude ignited within her. Later, the orchestra struck up a waltz, and he turned to her. "It is expected," he said, his voice flat. He led her onto the dance floor, and as he took her in his arms, the forced physical closeness was a shock to her system. One hand held hers, the other rested firmly on her back, his touch sending a strange, unfamiliar current through her. They moved together with a surprising grace, two strangers bound by a contract, performing a pantomime of marital harmony for the watching eyes of the ton. The dance was a strange mix of awkwardness and a new, undeniable awareness. She was intensely conscious of the strength in his hand, the breadth of his shoulders, the clean, masculine scent of his cologne. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable in the glittering candlelight. But his grip seemed to tighten ever so slightly. It was no longer the hand of ownership she had felt at the chapel, or the impersonal guidance from earlier. In that moment, as he guided her through the intricate steps of the waltz, shielding her from the prying eyes and whispered judgments of the room, his touch felt different. It felt, for the first time, almost protective. The autumn air, once crisp and invigorating, had taken on a damp chill that seemed to seep into the very stones of Ashcroft Manor. It was during one of her morning consultations with Mrs. Davies, reviewing the week's menus and household expenditures, that Margaret first heard of the trouble at the tenant farm. A young housemaid, her face pale with worry, mentioned that the bailiff's youngest son, a boy of 6, had been taken by a fever that would not break. The doctor had been, she whispered, but had shaken his head and spoken of God's will. The words sent a chill through Margaret that had nothing to do with the autumn air. She remembered her own mother, a woman of gentle birth but practical knowledge, who had kept a detailed book of herbal remedies. Margaret had spent hours as a girl learning the properties of feverfew, yarrow, and willow bark. While the men of her class learned to hunt and manage accounts, she had learned to heal. Without a second thought, she excused herself. She went not to her grand bedroom, but to the kitchens, where she requested strong broths be made ready. Then, gathering a basket and a small satchel, she walked out to the herb garden, a corner of the estate that had been left to go wild, but which, under her recent care, was beginning to show signs of order again. Her fingers, nimble and sure, plucked the necessary leaves and flowers, her mind clear and focused. This was a problem, she understood, a crisis that could be met not with titles or money, but with competence and care. She did not take a carriage. She walked the mile to the tenant's cottage, the hem of her fine wool dress collecting burrs and damp earth, a detail that never once crossed her mind. The cottage was small, 2 rooms with a packed earth floor and the smoky scent of a peat fire. The farmer's wife, a woman with eyes red-rimmed from weeping and exhaustion, looked up at the sight of the Duchess on her doorstep, her expression a mixture of awe and utter despair. Margaret offered a small, reassuring smile. "I heard your son is unwell," she said, her voice calm and gentle. "My mother was skilled with fevers. Perhaps I can be of some help." She did not wait for permission, but stepped inside, her presence a beacon of quiet authority. The boy was lying on a small cot, his face flushed, his breathing shallow and rapid. Margaret knelt on the floor, heedless of the dirt, and placed a cool hand on his forehead. The heat was terrifying. For the next several hours, the Duchess of Ashcroft was gone, replaced by Margaret Wren. She brewed a tea from yarrow to bring on a sweat and willow bark to ease the pain. She gently bathed the child's feverish head with cool, lavender-scented water. She spooned warm, nourishing broth between his cracked lips and spoke in low, soothing tones to the distraught mother, sharing stories of her own brother's childhood illnesses, creating a fragile bond of shared humanity between two women from different worlds. Henry was on his afternoon ride, a routine inspection of his estate's boundaries, when he saw the cluster of anxious tenants outside the bailiff's cottage. Annoyed at the potential disruption, he dismounted, his expression grim. He expected to find a dispute, a complaint, some petty drama he would have to resolve. He strode to the doorway and stopped dead. The scene before him was one he could not process. In the dim, smoky interior of the humble cottage, his wife, the Duchess, was kneeling on the floor. Her elegant dress was soiled at the knees, a stray piece of straw was caught in her immaculately styled hair, and she was leaning over the sickbed, her face a mask of intense, gentle concentration, as she bathed a child's face with a soft cloth. There was no performance in her actions, no play for approval. She was completely absorbed, her compassion a palpable force in the small room. He stood in the doorway, unseen, and watched her. He had bought this woman, acquired her as one might acquire a piece of property to fulfill a need. He had expected her to be decorative, manageable, and to perform her duties with quiet efficiency. He had never once considered the person within the role, the character of the woman he had bound to him. Now, watching her, he saw a quality he did not understand but was profoundly moved by. He saw an innate goodness, a strength that had nothing to do with titles or defiance, but was rooted in a deep, unwavering well of kindness. The image of his Duchess, his cold, contractual bride, kneeling on the dirt floor of a poor cottage to comfort a sick child, fundamentally and irrevocably shifted his perception of her. She was not the woman he had bought. She was a person of profound, unsettling character, and for the first time he felt a flicker of something other than irritation or grudging respect. It was a feeling he could not name, but it felt dangerously close to admiration. A crash from the far end of the house shattered the deep silence of the night. Margaret sat bolt upright in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sound had been violent, a splintering of wood followed by the heavy thud of something falling. Her first thought was of an intruder, a thief brazen enough to break into the fortress of Ashcroft Manor. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her, but it was followed by another, more immediate concern. Henry. His study was in the main part of the house, but the sound had come from the direction of the west wing, the forbidden wing. Slipping from her bed, she grabbed the heaviest object she could find, a brass candlestick from her mantelpiece, and crept out of her room. The corridor was a river of shadows, the moonlight painting eerie, skeletal patterns on the floor. She moved silently, her senses on high alert, every creak of the old house a potential threat. As she drew closer to the junction that led to the west wing, she heard a sound that was not a threat, but a lament. It was a low, guttural sob, the sound of a man in absolute agony. She rounded the corner and stopped, the candlestick lowering in her hand. There, slumped against the locked door of a room deep within the forbidden wing, was Henry. He was not the controlled, commanding Duke she knew. He was a wreck. His formal evening clothes were disheveled, his cravat torn open at the neck. An overturned candelabra lay on the floor beside him, the source of the crash. An empty bottle of brandy had rolled into the corner. The air was thick with the smell of it, and with a grief so raw and powerful, it felt like a physical presence in the cold air. His face, usually a mask of impenetrable control, was twisted in a torment she could barely comprehend. His eyes were closed, but tears tracked through the faint stubble on his cheeks. He was muttering a name, over and over, a desperate, broken whisper. Eleanor, Eleanor. He must have sensed her presence, because his eyes snapped open. They were wild, unfocused, and filled with a pain so profound it stole her breath. When he saw her, the raw agony morphed instantly into a furious, defensive rage. "Get out," he snarled, his voice thick and slurred with drink and unshed tears. He struggled to his feet, using the wall for support. "I told you this place was forbidden to you. You are hurt," she said, taking a hesitant step forward, her fear for her own safety completely eclipsed by the shocking sight of his suffering. "Get back to your room," he commanded, his voice cracking. This is my burden to bear, not yours. You have no place here. He looked at her white nightdress and her pale, concerned face, and something inside him seemed to break. You have no place in this. She saw past the anger, past the drunken fury, to the broken man beneath. The mystery of his coldness, of his self-imposed isolation, was suddenly cast in a new, tragic light. This was not a man who lacked a heart. This was a man whose heart was shattered. A surprising and powerful wave of empathy washed over her, so strong it was almost a physical force. She took another step. "Henry," she said, the name a deliberate crossing of the chasm between them. It was not the Duchess speaking to the Duke. It was Margaret speaking to a man in pain. "Let me help you." Her use of his name, the undisguised pity and concern in her eyes, seemed to enrage him further. "Help me?" He laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "You cannot help me. No one can." He pointed a trembling finger down the hall. "Go. Now, before you see more than you were ever meant to." She held his gaze for a moment longer, her heart aching for him, for the profound loneliness of his grief. Then, knowing she could do nothing more, she turned and retreated, leaving him to his ghosts in the cold, dark corridor. But as she walked back to her room, she knew something had fundamentally changed. She had seen behind the mask, and the tormented man she had found there was infinitely more compelling and infinitely more dangerous to her peace of mind than the cold, cruel Duke she had married. The following morning, the atmosphere at breakfast was thick enough to cut with a knife. The vast, empty dining room, with its long, polished table, had always felt like a symbol of their arrangement, a formal battlefield where they met each morning in a state of polite, silent truce. Henry sat at the head of the table, a grim, unmoving statue. Margaret was always seated at the far end, a lonely figure 20 feet away, the distance a physical representation of their emotional chasm. He was already there when she entered, staring into a cup of coffee as if it held the secrets to the universe. He was pale, his eyes shadowed with lack of sleep and the lingering effects of his grief. He radiated a keep-out aura that was more formidable than any locked door. He did not look up as she entered. Normally, she would have taken her place at the far end of the table, and they would have endured the meal in their customary, frigid silence. But the memory of the previous night, of his raw pain and her own shocking wave of empathy, had changed the rules. She could not retreat to her side of the battlefield, not anymore. She walked not to her usual chair, but to the footman who stood waiting by the sideboard. "Please set my place here," she said, her voice quiet but firm, indicating the chair directly to the right of the Duke. The footman froze, his eyes wide with alarm, and he flicked a terrified glance toward his master. It was a breach of protocol so profound as to be unthinkable. But Margaret's expression was calm and unyielding. With a trembling hand, the servant did as he was told, quickly and silently laying out the silver and china beside the Duke. Henry's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as he watched her take her seat. He was visibly unnerved, his knuckles white where he gripped his coffee cup. This was a direct challenge to their unspoken rules, a deliberate intrusion into his fiercely guarded space. He opened his mouth, a harsh command to have her move, to restore the order of their cold arrangement, already forming on his lips. But she did not speak. She did not look at him with pity or ask probing questions. She simply unfolded her napkin, accepted a plate of toast from the footman, and began to eat. Her presence beside him was a quiet, unwavering statement. It was not an attack. It was an act of solidarity. She was not prying into his grief. She was simply refusing to allow him to suffer it in complete isolation. Her physical proximity was a silent declaration. "I am here. I will not be pushed away." He was trapped. He could not order her away without creating a scene, without acknowledging the very intimacy he was so desperate to deny. He was caught between his all-consuming desire for isolation and a nascent, unwilling, and deeply unsettling comfort in her presence. The silence stretched, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was not empty. It was charged with her quiet strength, her steadfast refusal to be treated as an irrelevant part of the household. He could feel the warmth of her body, smell the faint, clean scent of lavender that always clung to her. It was an unwelcome invasion, and yet it was not entirely unwelcome. He did not tell her to move. He picked up his fork, the gesture stiff and reluctant, and began to eat. It was a concession, A surrender in a battle he hadn't even known they were fighting, and for Margaret, it was a victory more significant than any spoken words. The ice was not gone, but for the first time she had found a crack, and she had wedged herself firmly within it, a quiet, persistent force against the cold. The thawing of the Duke had begun. While Margaret was waging a quiet war for her husband's soul within the cold stone walls of Ashcroft Manor, her brother Arthur was fighting a battle of his own in the bustling, indifferent heart of London. The crushing guilt of his sister's sacrifice had been a crucible, burning away the last vestiges of his youthful arrogance and forging in its place a grim, unwavering resolve. He had secured a respectable, if modest, position with a shipping firm, and every shilling he earned, every penny he could save, was set aside with a single, obsessive purpose: to free Margaret. He finally found the courage to act, not by confronting the Duke, an act he knew would be futile and foolish, but by seeking counsel. He presented himself at the Gray's Inn offices of Mr. Albright, a solicitor who had served the Wren family for 2 generations. The office was the antithesis of the Duke's study, a room of comfortable clutter, smelling of paper and ink and justice, not of power and intimidation. Mr. Albright, a man with kind eyes and a shrewd, downturned mouth, listened with growing horror as Arthur, his voice low and strained, confessed the entire sordid tale. He spared himself nothing, detailing the gambling debts, the threat of ruin, and the Duke's cold, contractual proposal. "He bought her," Arthur finished, his voice cracking with self-loathing. "He bought my sister as one would purchase livestock, to serve a purpose, and I stood by and let it happen." The solicitor leaned back in his chair, his fingertips pressed together, his expression grave. "This is a most irregular and frankly appalling arrangement, Arthur. A contract for marriage made under duress. To settle a third party's debt, it is morally reprehensible, and its legality is questionable at best." He looked at the young man before him, seeing not the fool who had fallen into debt, but the brother desperate to atone. "Your sister, is she well? Is she safe?" "Her letters are correct," Arthur said, the word tasting like ash. "She speaks of managing the household, of the weather. There is no life in them, no joy. I fear for her, sir. I fear she is trapped in a gilded cage with a man who has no heart. The Duke of Ashcroft has a reputation for being a man of immense control and little sentiment." Mr. Albright mused, his gaze distant. "But this is beyond coldness. This is coercion." He leaned forward, his decision made. "I cannot promise an easy solution. The Duke is a powerful man, and a public scandal would harm Margaret as much as it would him. But I will not stand by and allow the daughter of my old friend to be treated as chattel. I will begin a discreet investigation into the Duke's affairs. We must understand the man she is married to, and we must find a way to give her back her freedom, with her reputation and future intact." Arthur felt a surge of hope so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. It was a slim chance, a single candle lit against a hurricane, but it was more than he had dared to hope for. He was no longer alone in his guilt. He had an ally. An external threat to Henry's carefully constructed world was now in motion, a potential lifeline cast toward the Duchess, who was, at that very moment, beginning to wonder if she even wanted to be saved. Back at Ashcroft Manor, a subtle but profound shift had occurred in the household's ecosystem. The staff, who had initially viewed their new Duchess with suspicion, had been won over by her quiet dignity, her fairness, and her genuine interest in their welfare. She knew their names, asked after their families, and managed the grand house with a competence that was both firm and kind. The most significant conversion had been that of Mrs. Davies. The housekeeper's fierce loyalty, once given solely to the Duke and the memory of his mother, had slowly, almost grudgingly, extended to include Margaret. She saw the young woman's loneliness, the quiet sadness that sometimes shadowed her eyes, and the unwavering strength with which she faced her difficult marriage. Respect had blossomed into a fierce, protective affection. One crisp afternoon, as the last of the autumn roses were shedding their petals, Mrs. Davies found Margaret in the garden, a place that had been the particular pride of the late Duchess, Henry's mother. Margaret was attempting to prune a climbing rose that had grown wild, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Allow me, Your Grace," the housekeeper said, her voice softer than usual. She took the shears from Margaret's gloved hands. "Lady Ashcroft, the Duke's mother, taught me how to manage these," she said. A rose, like a person, needs a firm hand but a gentle heart to truly flourish. They worked in companionable silence for a few moments, the snip of the shears a rhythmic counterpoint to the rustle of the dry leaves. Then, Mrs. Davies paused, her gaze fixed on the dark, brooding mass of the west wing, visible over the garden wall. "He was not always like this, you know," she said quietly. Margaret stopped her work, her heart giving a sudden, sharp thump. She knew, instinctively, who he was. "Before the accident," Mrs. Davies continued, her voice a low murmur, "he was a different man, full of life. He would laugh, a real deep laugh that would echo in the halls. He and Lady Eleanor, they were everything to each other." The name hung in the air, Eleanor. The name Henry had whispered in his drunken grief. Lady Eleanor was his first love, his only love, the housekeeper explained, her eyes clouding with memory. They were to be married. She was vibrant, fearless. She loved to ride as much as he did. One morning, they were out riding on the North Ridge. Her horse stumbled. A freak accident. He was with her. He held her as she. Mrs. Davies's voice faltered, and she took a steadying breath. The accident took more than just her. It took him, too. He locked his heart away after that. He locked it in that wing with her. She gestured with her head toward the forbidden corridor. Those were her rooms. He has kept them just as she left them. A shrine. He goes there sometimes to remember, or perhaps to punish himself. The puzzle of Henry Ashcroft, the man of ice and iron, was solved. Every cold word, every dismissive gesture, every moment of cruel detachment was suddenly, heartbreakingly reframed. He was not a man without a heart. He was a man guarding the shattered remnants of one. Margaret's feelings for him, that confusing, unsettling mixture of fear, fascination, and a burgeoning, unwanted tenderness, coalesced in that moment into a single, profound emotion, a deep, aching empathy that felt terrifyingly close to love. She looked at the cold stone of the West Wing, no longer seeing it as a symbol of his rejection of her, but as a tomb for his happiness, and she knew, with a certainty that shook her to her core, that she could no longer stand by and watch him live in it alone. Armed with the truth, Margaret felt a new sense of purpose. This was no longer about survival, about enduring her loveless contract. It was about reaching the man buried beneath the ice. That evening, she found him where she knew he would be, in the library, the site of their first, fleeting connection. He was not reading, but staring into the fire, a glass of brandy in his hand, his face a mask of grim solitude. She approached him not with the trepidation of a subordinate, but with the quiet confidence of an equal. She stood before him, waiting until he finally, reluctantly, lifted his gaze to meet hers. "I know about Eleanor," she said, her voice soft, devoid of accusation or pity. It was a simple statement of fact. The name spoken aloud in this room, in her voice, shattered his composure as surely as a hammer striking glass. The blood drained from his face, replaced by a surge of dark, furious color. He shot to his feet, the brandy sloshing in his glass. "What did you say?" he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "I am not judging you, Henry," she continued, her calm a stark contrast to his rising fury. "I only wish you would not carry such a burden alone." "You know nothing," he exploded, the sound ripping through the quiet sanctuary of the library. His control, the iron discipline that defined him, was gone, replaced by a torrent of raw, untamed grief and rage. "You think your quiet sympathies and your gentle act give you the right to trespass in my past, to speak her name? You have no right." He advanced on her, his eyes blazing with a pain so intense it was terrifying. "You were a convenience, a signature on a contract, a solution to a problem. You are the Duchess of Ashcroft because I bought and paid for you, nothing more." He was trying to hurt her, to push her away with the cold, hard truth of their transaction, but Margaret stood her ground, her heart aching for the man lashing out from behind his wall of pain. She saw the agony he was in, and she refused to be his enemy. He railed against her, his voice thick with years of unshed grief, accusing her of prying, of emotional manipulation, of trying to unpick the locks he had so carefully placed on his own heart. And then, in the white-hot heat of his denial, the truth slipped out, an unintentional confession born of pure, unadulterated rage at the woman who had breached his defenses. "You were never meant to be anything but a name and a title," he raged, his voice cracking. "You were never meant to make me. You were never meant to matter." The words hung in the air between them, raw and exposed. He stopped, his chest heaving, his own words echoing in the sudden, ringing silence. He had not meant to say it. He had not even allowed himself to think it. But the truth was out. His anger at her was not just about her discovery of his past. It was about her presence in his present. She, the woman he had acquired with such cold detachment, had become more than part of the bargain. She mattered. And that, to a man who had sworn never to feel again, was the most terrifying, unforgivable transgression of all. The city's underbelly had a memory as long and foul as the Thames itself. In the smoky, brandy-soaked confines of a Fleet Street gentlemen's club, a place where reputations were shredded for sport over cards and cigars, the story of the Duke of Ashcroft's marriage had been festering. The original moneylender, a man named Silas Croft with a perpetually greasy cravat and eyes like two chips of flint, was still incandescent with rage. He had been cheated not just of a fortune, but of the exquisite pleasure of ruining a family. The debt had been his prize, his leverage, and the Duke had snatched it away for nothing more than a signature. Croft, his tongue loosened by cheap brandy, had been complaining loudly to anyone who would listen. "Bought the debt right out from under me, he did," he'd grumble, his voice a whining drone. "The great Duke of Ashcroft, stooping to pluck a little bird from my hand. And for what? A chit of a girl with a ruined brother. There's a story there, I tell you, a story worth more than the debt itself." Most of his audience dismissed him as a bitter drunk, but one man listened with keen interest. Lord Harrington, a rival of Henry's whose ambition was matched only by his jealousy, overheard Croft's ramblings. Harrington had long chafed under the shadow of Ashcroft's immense wealth and influence, and he saw the glimmer of an opportunity, a chink in the Duke's impenetrable armor. He steered the disgruntled moneylender into a quieter corner, his expression one of deep, feigned sympathy. "A fascinating predicament, Mr. Croft," Harrington said, his voice smooth as oiled silk. "One might almost call it an injustice. Pray, tell me more about this arrangement." As Croft, flattered by the attention of a lord, began to spill the sordid details, a third figure drifted toward them, drawn by the scent of scandal like a shark to blood. It was Lady Beatrice, her face a mask of polite interest, her eyes glittering with malice. She had not forgotten the sting of Henry's public rebuke, and had been waiting for a chance to return the favor with interest. "Lord Harrington, Mr. Croft," she purred, joining their little conspiracy. "I couldn't help but overhear the Duke's name. I do hope there is no trouble." "On the contrary, Lady Beatrice," Harrington smiled, a predator's grin. "I believe Mr. Croft was just about to illuminate a most curious matter of business. It seems our reclusive Duke has a taste for blackmail." Between Croft's bitter recollections and Harrington's pointed questions, the story took shape, ugly and twisted. They painted a picture of a desperate, social climbing girl and her feckless brother who had conspired to trap the wealthiest duke in England. The truth of Margaret's sacrifice was conveniently ignored, replaced by a narrative of cunning ambition. Lady Beatrice listened, her smile growing wider with each damning detail. "This is more than just drawing-room gossip," she breathed, her mind already working. "This is a scandal of the first order. The public would be fascinated." She tapped a finger to her lips. "I happen to be acquainted with a certain columnist for the Morning Chronicle, a man with a very sharp pen and very few scruples. If the story were presented to him in just the right way, I imagine it would cause quite a stir." Harrington's eyes lit up. "Beatrice, you are a genius." "I am merely a proponent of the truth," she said, her voice dripping with false piety. "And the truth is that the Duke of Ashcroft has been made a fool of. It is our social duty to see that such deceptions are brought into the light." Croft, seeing his revenge taking shape, rubbed his hands together gleefully. "Make him a laughingstock, that's all I ask. Make the whole city laugh at the great, cold Duke and his bargain-bin Duchess." And so, in a smoky corner of a disreputable club, the poison was mixed. The story was carefully crafted, its details twisted for maximum damage, ensuring that when it broke, it would not just embarrass, but humiliate. It was an attack aimed not just at Henry's pride, but at the very foundation of Margaret's honor. The poison pen was poised, ready to strike. The column appeared on a Tuesday, the day of a much-anticipated performance of Don Giovanni at the Royal Opera House. The article was a masterpiece of insinuation and veiled accusation, published under the headline, "A Ducal Debt, how a baronet's daughter paid her brother's tab. It spoke of a ruinous gambling debt, a desperate family, and a suspiciously swift marriage to a reclusive and powerful duke. It painted Margaret as a cunning adventuress who had sold herself to save her family's name, and Henry as a cold-blooded fool who had been trapped by her wiles. The scandal erupted across London like a fire in a dry field. By evening, every drawing room, every club, every salon was buzzing with the story. When Henry and Margaret's carriage pulled up to the glittering entrance of the Royal Opera House, they stepped out into a wall of sound that was not the usual deferential murmur. It was a cacophony of whispers, of barely concealed snickers, of triumphant, knowing smirks. Margaret felt it first, a physical blow of public shame. The sea of faces in the grand gaslit foyer, which should have been a blur of polite smiles and respectful nods, had become a gallery of judges and executioners. She saw Lady Beatrice standing with a circle of her cronies, a triumphant smile playing on her lips. She saw men who usually bowed to Henry, now looking at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. She saw women who had once courted her favor, now turning their shoulders, their fans fluttering like the wings of agitated birds. The whispers followed them as they ascended the grand staircase, sharp and pointed as shards of glass. Bought her, they say. Brother gambled away their entire fortune. A contract, not a marriage. How utterly humiliating for him. Mortification, hot and suffocating, washed over her. She wanted to flee, to hide, to disappear into the floor. But then she felt Henry's hand on her back, his touch firm and steady. She remembered the cold stone of Ashcroft Manor, the silent challenge in Mrs. Davis's eyes, the drunken grief in her husband's. She had faced down the coldness of a duke and the ghosts of his past. She would not be broken by the gossip of fools. She lifted her chin, her posture becoming not just elegant, but regal. She met the hostile stares with a look of serene, unbothered calm, her face a perfect mask of a duchess above such petty concerns. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. She would not let them see her bleed. Henry, who had at first been filled with a cold, familiar rage at this attack on his name, found his attention shifting. He looked away from the sneering faces of his peers and looked at his wife. He saw the slight tremor in her hand as she held her opera glasses, the rigid set of her jaw, the immense effort it took for her to maintain her composure. He saw her pain, and he saw her incredible, unyielding courage. In that moment, something inside him snapped. This was no longer about his name or his pride. This was about her. They were hurting her. They were taking her quiet dignity, her innate goodness, and twisting it into something ugly and cheap. A wave of rage, hotter and more personal than any he had ever known, surged through him. It was a primal, protective fury. Her honor, he realized with a clarity that was both terrifying and exhilarating, had become inseparable from his own. He could not bear to see her hurt. The contract, the bargain, the cold logic of their arrangement, all of it burned away in the fire of that single, stunning revelation. He looked at the woman beside him, the woman he had bought, and knew, with absolute certainty, that he would burn the world to the ground before he let them break her. The moment the heavy oak door of their London townhouse closed behind them, shutting out the noise and the judgment of the city, the fragile facade of their composure crumbled. The air in the drawing-room, usually so formal and still, was charged with the lingering humiliation of the evening. Henry began to pace, his movements sharp and agitated, like a caged tiger. He ripped his gloves from his hands and threw them onto a table, his face a thunderous mask of fury. He was waiting for the dam to break, for the tears and accusations he was sure were coming. He had dragged her into this public disgrace, exposed her to the viciousness of the ton. He deserved her anger, her recriminations, her hatred. But Margaret did not weep. She stood by the fireplace, her hands clasped before her, her expression not one of anger, but of a deep, weary sadness. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but it cut through his rage more effectively than any shout. "They have ruined you," she said, her gaze fixed on his face. "Your name, your reputation, all because of me." He stopped pacing, stunned into silence. He had expected her to be concerned for herself, for her own honor. He had been prepared to defend himself against her accusations. But her primary concern, even now after the public flogging she had endured, was for him, for the damage to his name. Her loyalty, so undeserved, so utterly unexpected, was like a physical blow. It stripped away his anger, leaving behind a raw, hollow ache of self-loathing. He looked at her pale, tired face and the unwavering strength in her eyes, and he hated himself for what he had done to her. He had taken this woman, this person of quiet integrity and profound kindness, and chained her to his own miserable existence, only to see her dragged through the mud on his account. "This was not part of our agreement," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could not name. "This public disgrace, I will not have you subjected to it." He walked to the decanter of brandy, pouring a glass with a hand that was not entirely steady. He needed to fix this. He needed to protect her, not just from the gossips, but from himself. He turned to face her, his decision made. It was the first truly selfless thought he had had in years, and the words felt foreign and heavy on his tongue. "I will release you from the contract," he said, the words stark in the quiet room. "I will arrange for a quiet annulment. It can be done discreetly. I will provide you with a generous, independent fortune, enough to live comfortably wherever you choose. You can go to the continent, to America, anywhere you wish. You can be free of this, free of the scandal, and free of me." He was offering her an escape, an exit from the cage he had built around her. He was willing to face the scandal alone, to let society think the worst of him, if it meant she could be safe and whole again. He was offering her the very thing he had stolen from her, her future. Margaret stared at him, her heart pounding. Freedom, it was what she had once thought she wanted more than anything. The chance to walk away from this cold, complicated man and his world of shadows. He was offering her a clean slate, a life of her own. But as she looked at him, at the genuine pain and self-hatred in his eyes, at the man who was willing to sacrifice his own pride to protect her, she knew that the freedom he was offering was no longer what she wanted. The cage had become a sanctuary, and its keeper had become the man she loved. "You would simply send me away?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, but the question was a challenge, a demand. "Is that what you truly want, Henry?" His question hung in the air, a genuine offer of escape, a key to a cage she had only just realized she no longer wished to leave. Margaret looked at him, truly looked at him, past the title and the wealth and the cold facade he presented to the world. She saw the deep, abiding pain in his eyes, the self-loathing that had been his constant companion for years, and the flicker of a desperate, unwilling hope that she might, somehow, be his salvation. The freedom he offered was a vast, empty expanse compared to the rich, complicated, and challenging world she had found with him. "No," she said, her voice quiet but imbued with a strength that made him flinch as if she had shouted, "I will not be sent away." She stepped closer, closing the space he always kept between them, a deliberate and final breach of their cold contract. "I will not be discarded like a failed investment, Your Grace," she said, a hint of steel in her tone. "When I married you, I accepted the terms. I became the Duchess of Ashcroft. Your world is now my world. Your battle is my battle. I will not run from whispers and scandal. I will stand with you." He stared at her, utterly bewildered. This was not the reaction he had anticipated. He had offered her everything a woman in her position could want, freedom and fortune, and she was refusing. "Why?" he asked, the word a raw whisper. "Why would you choose this public ruin, when you could walk away?" Here, in the quiet of the room, with the shame of the evening still clinging to them, Margaret finally let her own truth be known. It was a truth that had grown silently, in the warmth of a library fire, in the shared concern for a sick child, in the aching empathy for his hidden grief. "Because I did not expect it," she began, her gaze unwavering, "and I certainly did not want it. But I have fallen in love with you, Henry." She spoke his name without its title, a final claim of intimacy. The confession was not a flight of fancy, not a girlish declaration, but a simple, profound, and unshakable fact. It was the quietest, most powerful blow he had ever received. Henry was stunned into absolute silence. The glass of brandy trembled in his hand. Love. It was a word he had banished from his life, a ghost he had locked away in the West Wing with all his other dead dreams. He had built a fortress of ice and cynicism around his heart, and this woman, this quiet, unassuming woman he had tried so hard to keep at a distance, had just walked through its walls as if they were nothing but mist. He had offered her a fortune to leave, and she had answered with a treasure he thought he would never possess again. He was overwhelmed, undone, his carefully constructed world irrevocably and beautifully shattered by a love he had done nothing to earn and everything to repel. Instead of hiding from the scandal, they walked directly into its heart. 3 nights later, a grand charity ball was being held at the home of the Dowager Countess of Pembroke, a formidable society matriarch whose opinion could make or break a reputation with a single, well-placed word. To appear there was a gamble of the highest order. To stay away would be an admission of guilt. When the Duke and Duchess of Ashcroft were announced, a wave of silence, thick with anticipation and malice, rolled through the glittering ballroom. Margaret, on Henry's arm, felt the familiar sting of 100 hostile eyes. But tonight was different. She was not a victim enduring her shame. She was a soldier standing on the field of battle beside her commander. Beside them, tall and resolute, was Arthur. He had come from his office the moment he heard of the scandal, his face pale with fury on his sister's behalf, and had insisted on accompanying them, ready to defend her honor to any man who dared question it. They did not have to wait long. Lady Beatrice, flanked by Lord Harrington, glided toward them, her face a mask of triumphant pity. "Your Grace," she cooed, her voice loud enough for the surrounding crowd to hear. "How brave of you to show your face. One must admire your resilience, though some might call it shamelessness." Henry did not rise to the bait. He did not offer a cold retort or a cutting remark. He simply looked at the circle of expectant faces, his expression unreadable. Then he began to speak, his voice not loud, but carrying a raw, compelling honesty that commanded attention. "The rumors," he began, his gaze sweeping the room, "are true." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Lady Beatrice's smile widened. "I entered into this marriage for the coldest and most selfish of reasons," Henry continued, his voice unwavering. "I was a broken man, and I behaved without honor. I used my power and this young lady's desperate circumstances to secure a duchess. The arrangement was a contract, born of my own cynicism and despair." He paused, letting the weight of his confession settle. He then turned his eyes to Margaret, and the cold, hard mask of the Duke fell away, revealing the man beneath, his face filled with an emotion so raw and powerful it silenced every whisper. "But my cynical bargain," he said, his voice thick with feeling, "led me to the greatest treasure of my life. It led me to a woman of such profound kindness, courage, and integrity that she has, against all odds, managed to save me from myself. My wife's heart, which I did nothing to deserve and everything to discourage, has been my salvation. The scandal is not that she married me, but that a man like me could be worthy of a woman like her. And I will spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of her love." He then lifted Margaret's hand to his lips and kissed it, not as a duke to a duchess, but as a man devoted to his wife, a public declaration of love and loyalty that was more powerful than any denial. Before the stunned crowd could react, Arthur stepped forward, his own face set with a new, hard-won maturity. "My sister acted not for ambition, but for love of her family," he stated, his voice clear and strong. "My foolishness created the crisis. Her sacrifice was an act of honor, the purest I have ever known. Any man who suggests otherwise answers to me." The sheer, unvarnished truth of their united front was a force of nature. It swept away the salacious gossip and the petty malice, replacing it with a story of redemption, loyalty, and love. The Dowager Countess of Pembroke, who had been watching the entire exchange with her sharp, intelligent eyes, moved toward them. She tapped Lady Beatrice on the arm with her fan, a gesture of dismissal as sharp as a slap. "Beatrice," the Countess said, her voice carrying the weight of undisputed authority, "you are a fool. Character is not determined by how one begins, but by how one chooses to continue." She turned to Henry and Margaret, a genuine smile warming her stern features. "Your Grace, Duchess, welcome. It seems you have brought something far more interesting than gossip to my ball tonight. You have brought honor." With the Countess's approval, the tide of public opinion turned. The whispers died, replaced by murmurs of admiration. The story of the Blackmail marriage was eclipsed by the legend of the Duke, who had publicly confessed his love, and the Duchess, who had saved him. Weeks later, the scandal had faded into the annals of society legend. Ashcroft Manor was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the peaceful silence of a home, not the empty silence of a tomb. One crisp, sunny afternoon, Henry found Margaret in the garden. He said nothing, but simply took her hand and led her back into the house. He led her past the grand staircase, past the library, and down the long, cold corridor to the west wing. He stopped before the locked door that had been the source of so much pain and mystery. From his waistcoat pocket, he produced a single ornate brass key. He did not unlock the door himself. He placed the key in Margaret's hand. "Together," he said, his voice quiet. She looked at him, her heart full, and then fitted the key into the lock. It turned with a heavy, grating sound, like a sigh held for too long. He pushed the door open, and they stepped inside. The rooms were preserved under white dust sheets, the furniture like sleeping ghosts under the pale light filtering through the grimy windows. The air was stale, thick with the scent of dust and faded potpourri. It was a shrine to a memory, a place frozen in time. Henry walked to a window, and with a great heave, pushed it open. Fresh, clean air and bright sunlight flooded the room, disturbing the dust motes, making them dance in the light. He turned to Margaret, a small, sad smile on his face. "It is time to let the light in," he said. Together, they began to work. They did not throw things away. They carefully, gently, folded the linens and packed away the delicate dresses and personal trinkets into cedar chests. It was not an act of erasure, but of peace. They were not burying the past, but making way for the future. With every item they packed, with every sheet they folded back, they were letting go of the ghost of Eleanor and affirming their own living, breathing partnership. Henry was finally letting go of his grief, and by doing it with Margaret, by allowing her into the most sacred and painful part of his heart, he was affirming that she, and she alone, was his future. A year later, the gardens of Ashcroft Manor were a riot of colour. Under Margaret's devoted care, the roses bloomed with an almost defiant vibrancy, and the air was alive with the hum of bees and the scent of lavender and honeysuckle. The sun was warm on the stone bench where Margaret sat reading, a book resting in her lap. She heard the crunch of his boots on the gravel path and looked up, a slow, happy smile spreading across her face. Henry joined her on the bench, his arm sliding naturally around her shoulders. The cold, commanding Duke was gone forever, replaced by a man at peace, his face, once a mask of ice, now filled with a warm, abiding love as he looked at his wife. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. "What are you reading?" he asked, his voice a low, contented murmur against her hair. "Poetry," she said, tilting the book so he could see. "Mrs. Browning." He smiled, a genuine, easy smile that still made her heart leap. "An indulgence, I see." "A necessary one," she corrected gently. They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the play of sunlight on the leaves. The great, cold house behind them was no longer a fortress, but a home, its halls waiting to be filled with the laughter they now shared so easily. "I was thinking," Henry said, his voice thoughtful, "that the west wing has been empty for long enough. It has the best morning light. It would make a fine nursery." Margaret's breath caught, and she turned to look at him, her eyes shining with a joy so profound it needed no words. He looked at her, his own eyes reflecting that joy, that hope, that promise of a future they would build together. Their life had been built not on a contract, but on a love that had been strong enough to grow in the most barren of soils, a quiet heart that had conquered a kingdom of grief and won a victory for two.